Last year, the Calgary Flames made an unexpected push towards the playoffs, led by elite goaltending from Dustin Wolf. But will a lack of scoring haunt them in 2025-26? This is the 2025-26 deep dive on the Calgary Flames. Hello and welcome to team number 21 in my preseason power rankings, the Calgary Flames, who had a really fun season last year. They were a team that really overperformed expectations, led a lot by the extreme performance by Dustin Wolf, who was just incredible in his first full season in the NHL. And the Flames going into this year, I think, have a bit of expectations in terms of what fans expect. I don't know if they're in the same boat as some of these other teams where people think that they should be, a locked-in playoff team this year. However, based on the outlook of the Western Conference and kind of how things are shaking up, especially in the Pacific, that third seed in the Pacific is pretty wide open at the moment. And although I still have a couple Pacific teams ahead of them that could grab that third spot, Calgary is definitely in the running for potentially being able to steal that, especially if Dustin Wolf can continue playing at a extremely high level like he did last season. The biggest question for me is just the lack of improvement in terms of outside additions for this roster. Pairing with that, you have all the Rasmus Andersson stuff where he is potentially on the trade block, and it seems like they're kind of just waiting on that one, and that's definitely a knock on Craig Conroy and his staff because they just haven't been able to really utilize the asset that is Rasmus Andersson. We've kind of seen this go down the line here. I mean, we saw it with Noah Hannafin, and we've seen it, a couple other times here where the Flames just haven't been able to maximize value for their assets in favor of keeping the room together. And, when you're not competing for cups, keeping the room together shouldn't be the number one priority. It should be to improve the team. And for the Flames, that's kind of my biggest issue going into this, is I don't know if they did enough to take a step forward in terms of pushing for a playoff spot and competing for a playoff spot. I don't know if that necessarily happened for this team. But as we dive into their overall numbers here, 23rd in offense, 22nd in defense, 12th in goaltending, 23rd in special teams, and 19th in coaching culture, they're pretty even across the board. Like, there's not any area that I'd say is extremely weak for this team. Obviously, goaltending is the strength of this roster. But overall, they're pretty even across the board. I mean, there's a reason why they're 21st here, and I think you can kind of, put the pieces together here. All their numbers, aside from goaltending, are pretty much hovering around that, that 21st-ish ranking going into the season. So in terms of balance, the team is fairly balanced, and I think they're developing kind of at the same rate, which is good. But it also means that there's quite a bit of improvement that needs to happen across the board. And nothing to really, hang your hat on here aside from obviously Dustin Wolf. And, if you've been following me for a while, I've always said, goaltending is volatile, and you never know what you're going to get from him, right? I think all signs point to Dustin Wolf continuing to improve and continuing to push into being, a top 10, a strong top 10 goaltender in the NHL. But goalies are weird, right? You could very easily just, collapse this season because that's just kind of the nature of the position. But as we jump into coaching culture, I think this is the interesting debate to happen here, because I think you have, a conversation here where Craig Conroy has done a good job in Calgary. Now, again, I think that his asset management in terms of, some of his key assets, the Noah Hannafin trade wasn't great, and the Rasmus Andersson situation has just kind of lingered, and they seem to be, as days keep going by, it seems like the options for Rasmus Andersson continue to get limited, and the return continues to get limited on what they could get back for him as, his contract continues to, take up less and less time with an organization. It's interesting because I think that that's kind of the story of Craig Conroy's reign, and I don't think that he's done a good enough job addressing the needs of this roster. Now, again, last year, the Flames didn't think they were going to be, pushing for a playoff spot, but maybe they did. I don't know. I didn't. And certainly they exceeded expectations last season because of that. But, the issues on the team, the secondary scoring was a big issue. It wasn't really addressed even this offseason. The defense, getting, moving on from Rasmus Andersson and then finding a replacement for him hasn't been done yet. So it's becoming a kind of a trend with Craig Conroy here, and it seems like the culture is good. People enjoy playing in Calgary for the most part. It doesn't seem like there's any crazy, locker room tensions, aside from Anderson requesting a trade, or at least not re-signing. But at the end of the day, like, his job is to create a winning team, and he's been fine, but I don't think he's done anything like astronomical to really, push this team ahead. I think his drafting's been solid, but even then, we need to start seeing those guys, play on the big team. Ryan Huska on the other side, I think has been, pretty good. I think he's exceeded expectations now for a couple years with a roster that has been, below where it probably should have been based on, he's had a better record than, has been expected. And I think that's a good sign for a team that's developing, right? Like, you continue to kind of expect them to take strides. And that's why, I do have a bit of hope in the Flames potentially pushing for a playoff spot this year, because he's been able to elevate a roster now for multiple seasons, and they're young enough that they should be improving kind of overall as a team. I don't think there's a ton of major regression candidates on this team. If anything, I think they should be better in that regard. And I think you have a coach here that's been able to get a lot out of this team, and that's been definitely a staple here, aside from the goaltending, kind of an underrated part of what the Flames have kind of done here. And I think just the lack of playoff success has led to Ryan not getting a ton of attention in that space. But we look at their numbers from last year and kind of just bouncing back on that. I mean, 6th in goals against, 12th in expected goals against. And we talk a lot about what Dustin Wolf did, but this was a top half of the league team in terms of their expected goals against allowed, and so that definitely helped too. I mean, obviously they Dustin Wolf was able to outplay those numbers, but he wasn't doing it on his own, right? He wasn't sitting out there carrying this team kind of on his own. And the Flames finished 4th in the Pacific last year, so saying that they could pass LA and grab that 3rd spot isn't unrealistic, right? Like, that's not a crazy thing to say. Obviously, I have them lower than that going into this, and I think a lot of that is because of the offense, right? I mean, 29th in goals for, 20th in expected goals for. They were not generating a lot of offense, and they weren't scoring. So they weren't out shooting there. It wasn't the Columbus situation where they were completely out shooting their expected goal numbers. They couldn't finish either, and that is something that I'd be concerned about, because I don't think they've done a ton to address that need. Now, they should be getting some progression from some guys, and that should help, right? Like, I think you expect some of the young guys on this team that we're going to talk about, guys like Coronado and Connor Zary, to improve, because they're young and they should be able to do that. So I'm not insanely concerned about that at the moment. And that's why I'm giving them a bit more benefit of the doubt in terms of their progression. But I do think that that's definitely an issue that needs to be addressed at some point if this team intends to compete for a playoff spot this year. So let's jump into this offense here. First of all, I want to mention that Joel Farabee should be a C in even strength offense, and that would drop his overall down based on my the math that I did to calculate the overalls. So he'd probably be sitting around a 77, 78-ish in terms of his overall. So just a quick note about Joel Farabee and that. I don't know why I mistyped. I had to type like 800 of these. So there was bound to be a couple that were wrong. I think this is like the first or second time that I've done that. So fair enough. But I caught it as I was preparing for this, and it was too late in the process to go and redo everything. So I just kind of wanted to mention that now. But aside from that, you have a team here that I think has some underrated players, right? Like Blake Coleman still has a bit left in the tank. Now his drop off has been pretty substantial last season. He had a poor season last year, which we'll dive into because I only used the numbers from last year in terms of this, but 3 years is what I kind of look at overall. But he definitely had a poor season last year. I believe that he has potential to bounce that back. I think that he's good enough that he should kind of get that benefit of the doubt. Sharon Govich, same thing. Poor season last year, but I definitely can see a bit of a bounce back there. Jonathan Huberdeau, I think, is very much underrated at this point. He's still a solid enough player. He just, obviously, like with how good Matthew Tkachuk has been and how bad that contract is, people just kind of write him off. But he's still like a useful player in a top six. Now, I don't think he should be a first liner. I think he's better suited to be a second liner, but he still provides value to the team, although like his contract obviously is overpaid and all that. But Nazem Kadri, again, continues to be one of the most underrated centers in the league. He is so versatile and still super dynamic. Now, again, took a step back last year. I believe that he should have an opportunity to kind of right that and have a better season this year. So it's really a lot of bounce backs here that I'm expecting for some of these older players on the team. Then you have guys like Morgan Frost, Mikael Backlund, who are good, very good defensive players. Connor Zary and Matt Coronado are obviously, younger players that you have a ton of hope in, taking that next step forward. So it's a good mix of veterans that I expect to have improved seasons and young players that I think, continue to step forward. So it gives me hope in that sense that I think they have kind of a good mix of players in that context. But it will be interesting to see kind of how that all comes together for the Flames as the season kind of progresses. First guy I want to talk about here is Nazem Kadri, who is still like a very, very effective player. First of all, he draws a ton of penalties, and that's something that he's kind of done throughout his career, as somebody who is a bit of an agitator. He's going to get into people's heads. He's going to get people to make that second push. His ability to create power play opportunities is very, very, very strong. He also does a very good job creating a lot of chances. Now, his finishing isn't great, but again, I think he had a poorer season than what we're used to for him last year. So he's one of those players that, again, I expect to have a better season than he did last year. Like, I think it's unlikely that every single player on the Calgary Flames last year that was like, not a prospect or a young player all regress at the same time and are just never going to be able to get back to that. I think we see at least a couple of them bounce back, and one of those players I'd expect to that is Nazem Kadri. Now, his defense is a bit of a concern. He is not a great defender. He's pretty below average in terms of defense, especially considering that he's going to be a first line center on this team. You'd hope that either the offense really comes back and shines, or he can improve slightly defensively. But that's one of those two things kind of needs to improve in order for him to generate more value here for the Calgary Flames. In terms of his power play numbers, it's fine. Like he's okay on special teams. He's nothing special. But again, he could be that's something that could potentially bounce back because his possession numbers are pretty good. He's not he's more of a possession type player anyway, so you might expect that to bounce back a little bit as well. So overall, like, I still think Nazem Kadri has a ton of value. I think if the Flames believe that they could push for a playoff spot, then holding on to him right now does make more sense than trading him, although there is teams that are interested because, he'd be a good second-line center for a lot of teams. But it doesn't sound like the Flames at this moment are willing to move him, and maybe that's Craig Conroy, holding on to an asset too long again. So time will tell, but if the Flames want to push for a playoff spot this season, then holding on to Kadri makes sense. If there's a good enough offer out there, then I take it, because I don't think even making the playoffs this year does a whole lot for the Flames, aside from gives experience to, the couple young players that are on the roster. But if you have a good offer out there for Kadri, like I'd take it, because second line centers are so valuable right now, and you have one that is aging and makes sense to move. I mean, obviously going to his age 35 season, I don't know how much trade value he has, but there might be some out there. So that's kind of something to kind of keep in mind here. I don't know how much he improves in terms of his offense production. I expect it to improve a little bit, but obviously being as old as he is, I don't think he's gonna turn out to drop a ton of points all of a sudden out of nowhere. But I do think that he'll be at least stable or slightly better than he was last season. Jonathan Huberdeau, like I said, is another guy here that I think is fairly underrated. Now, his contract is insane. $10.5 million for another 6 years, going into his age 32 season is wild, right? Like that's it's crazy. But in terms of his value, like he still does bring some value to the Flames, right? Like his play driving is good. His power play numbers are actually really solid. His penalty kill numbers are also pretty solid. His defense, obviously isn't there. He's never been known as a defensive first winger. I'd say it's like fine for what you expect from an offensive first, top 6 kind of winger. I don't expect much more than that from that type of player. But obviously his playmaking is the strength of his team, or the strength of his game. He's able to set up goal scoring opportunities fairly consistently, and that's where he gets a ton of his value from. And his finishing isn't bad either. So, you're talking about a player who does a really good job, setting up players, and hopefully with either Zary or Coronado, it's likely to be Zary, you can help kind of facilitate more chances to get more points for whichever one of the young players that he's likely playing with. And that should help, right? Like you're expecting him to bounce back. He had a better season last year than the year before, especially in terms of his finishing ability. So I'm expecting a similar type season here from Jonathan Huberdeau. I don't think he's going to light the world on fire, but you'd hope that he doesn't have to, because one or both of your young wingers can kind of step up and take that load off of his shoulders in terms of having to be the primary or one of the primary offensive generators on this team. And I think again, Huberdeau as like your fourth best forward is a lot better than him being like your first or second. One of those players that could take a step forward here is Connor Zary, who already puts up, very, very strong defensive numbers. His exits and retrievals are really strong. His zone entries are definitely his strength here. His ability to control possession as he enters the zone is massive. The only thing that he needs to improve on is his passing ability isn't great, and just the way he generates offense, right? Like he takes shots, but just his passing needs to improve. And if you can become a better facilitator off of those zone entries, then he becomes an extremely dangerous player, because at this point, if Connor Zary is coming off the puck and he gets into the zone, you're probably expecting him to shoot, or at least that's going to be the strength of his entry, and that kind of limits what you can do in terms of scheming around that. Right, because if he was a great facilitator, then he's somebody that can enter the zone through the neutral zone and then, dish it off to somebody else, and you can set something up offensively, whether that's, a set play and more of a possession style, or even an off the rush, quality chance. Whereas if the idea is that, he's not a good enough passer to reliably do that consistently, it becomes a lot more one-dimensional. It actually starts to limit what his value is as a puck carrier if that's the result that ends up happening. So improving that is key, I think, is improving his ability, as a facilitator, regardless of whether he's playing with elite shooters or not, because if you're entering the zone with possession as frequently as he is, the frequency of that will just generate goals, right? You don't need a great finisher that's going to score 40-plus goals. You just need people who can get pucks on net. And just the ability of getting the puck in quickly and getting shots off quickly, off of passes will lead to more offense just naturally, because that's just kind of how the game works. Or at least it will lead to more offensive chances, and then those will naturally, hopefully regress into goals over time. So it could be very similar. I think Connor Zary, if he can improve his passing, that's kind of the big thing here. But like it could look a lot like what the Brandon Gallagher, Philip Deneau, and Tom Tatar line looked like in Montreal, especially the year before they went to the Stanley Cup final, and that year actually, like those 2 seasons where they were just like the best possession line in the league by like a pretty substantial margin. And they just generated a ton of chances, and they didn't score nearly as much as they should have based on what they were generating, but they did score enough to look like a competent first line, and I think that's kind of what the Flames would be hoping for here with Kadri, Huberdeau, and Zary, if that is the line they end up going with, where you just have possession guys who can just generate a ton of chances, and then you're just hoping that enough of those go in to lift up that 29th overall goal scoring, and Connor Zary being able to be a better facilitator will be a big part of that, because he is the best puck carrier in terms of entries of those 3, and easily on the team. He's one of the best in the league, so like there's not hard to be the best on your team in that case. But he just needs to improve that passing, because it does diminish what he's doing in terms of entries if he can't facilitate and becomes one-dimensional once he gets the puck. Matt Coronado is another one of those players that is interesting in terms of being a younger guy on this team that could take a bigger leap forward, and he takes a lot of shots. He generates a lot of offense in terms of chances. His goal scoring isn't great. His finishing ability isn't as high as it should be based on the amount of shots that he takes. But you're talking about a guy here who does generate a ton of shots. He generates fairly decent amount of chances, and he's a very good forward checker. That is one of the highlights of his game, is just his ability to forward check. And work kind of off kind of a dump and chase, which is weird because they also have Connor Zary, who we just talked about, who's a fantastic entry possession kind of guy. So it's interesting how you have this huge difference between the two of them, and maybe there's something there in even trying to play them together to get something out of that, because then you have 2 guys who are just very different and can kind of like beat you in both ways, which might be useful, especially if Zary's carrying it in off the rush and then kind of dumping it in because his passing isn't very good. Like, I don't know. I'm just spitballing in terms of, how you can kind of throw these guys around to maybe get some more value out of it. And that's definitely something that I would, at least, like discuss in terms of trying and seeing what happens. But, overall you have a guy here again who's very good in terms of his forechecking. And I think that does help with, especially with like an older kind of top 6 around him, because there isn't a lot of players who are going to be able to win those battles. So having that ability, in your top 6 does help, because guys like Jonathan Huberdeau and Nazem Kadri, who even Mikael Backlund, right, who aren't really known for their speed in the best of times, are able to kind of get some of that help, especially as they get older, from a guy like Matt Coronado to win those battles. But again, this is a player who he's putting up pretty mediocre offensive and defensive numbers. I expect both of those to go up, and for the Flames' sake, you're hoping they both go up kind of together, and you're able to get somebody who's kind of a very good quote unquote 5-tool player, who can just do everything very well, right? Like, it seems like he could become kind of that jack of all trades type player. That seems to kind of be the mold, at least now, for Coronado. That seems to be the kind of player he's developing into. So you're hoping that can continue as his development continues. Blake Coleman, as I talked about in the intro, had a real bad season last year. Now, he is going into his age 34 season, which does scare me a little bit. But I think I've seen enough from Blake Coleman over the past number of years to kind of disregard what was a bad season for a lot of players on the Calgary Flames. Like, there was a bunch of guys who regressed a little bit, and they still almost made the playoffs. So you're like, I just kind of give players like this the benefit of the doubt. I mean, Coleman knows what it's going to take to bounce back. He's been a very useful middle 6 forward his whole career. I'm not really concerned about it, despite the fact of how bad his numbers looked last season. I do expect to see him bounce back here a little bit, and it might be it might be an age thing. That's very likely that this is just kind of the wall that Coleman's hitting now, and we're gonna know a couple months into the season. Like, even at the beginning of last season, he didn't look like the same player. You're hoping that the off season off can help him kind of reset, and they can figure out how to utilize him more as a player, because his defensive numbers are still solid, right? He's still putting up decent enough defensive numbers. It's the offense that has kind of disappeared. But even if he can kind of transition into being a pure defensive third line winger, that can still bring value to this team. But I still think that there's some offensive juice left in the tank for a Blake Coleman. It's just kind of about being able to extract that at this point in his career. Morgan Frost is a fascinating player because he is a all defense, no offense, 27-year-old going to his 27th season, center. And you're talking about somebody here who can be a extremely, extremely useful defensive center. And he does pair really well with kind of that Mikkel Backlund duo in the middle of this lineup that can just be, your shutdown low event kind of guys. And we saw that really work out for the Flames well last year, obviously, because they had excellent elite goaltending, but they also didn't allow a ton of chances, overall. And Morgan Frost definitely helped that as they made their push. So it was like, we're going to win games playing, low event hockey. We don't have to score a lot because we're not going to allow very many goals. Obviously, increasing that goal scoring would make that job a lot easier for them. But I really like Morgan Frost for what he is for this team. I think he fits that kind of identity really well in Calgary, and he kind of fits that mold of player. It's just about I don't expect Morgan Frost to have a crazy offensive output season. It would be nice, but I think it's easier to expect to bounce back from some of the other players we talked about, or just development from some of the other players we talked about over a Morgan Frost breakout season. But man, I mean, if he can start putting up some points and generating some offense, that would be a big help to the Flames as well, especially in kind of the middle of this lineup. Yura Sharangovich is another guy that I've really liked in the past, and then again just kind of hit a wall last season and really, really, really had a poor season. And I don't know what the solution is for all of these players kind of hitting a wall at the same time, because it's strange, and it's not even guys who are in the same age bracket, right? Like Sharangovich and Nazem Kadri and Blake Coleman are all kind of different ages. I guess Coleman and Kadri are pretty close, but you know what I mean, right? Where it's Sharangovich isn't in that group, so even Jonathan Huberdeau and Nazem Kadri are in a different kind of category. So I don't really understand, and that's kind of why I'm higher on the Flames being able to kind of figure it out, because the likelihood of all of these players at different points in their career just kind of hitting a wall at the same time and never going back to being good again is unlikely. But Sharangovich really didn't do anything well last season, right? His zone exits were really good. So I guess there's that, right? That's a pretty important thing to be good at. But aside from that, his shots off the rush were pretty league average. His assists on shots off the rush were also pretty league average. Other than that, he was pretty poor in mostly everything else. I hope that they can figure out how to use him, because he's such a unique player in terms of his toolkit that he could still add some value to a team. Now, do I think that Sharangovich becomes a strong bona fide top 6 winger that's going to be a rock in a top 2 lines on a cup team? Probably not at this point. But do I see Sharangovich still having the potential to become a pretty strong third line winger? Yeah. It just kind of, again, it's going to be about extracting that from him, and they clearly didn't do a very good job. Whether it was him or injuries or whatever, it really was a poor season for him overall. Mikkel Backlund, we talked about a little bit, and he does have a bit more of an offensive juice in him than some of the other players that we've touched on here from the on this team, and but he still brings that real strong defensive game, and which is super impressive for a guy who was 35 last year going into his age 36 season, which again is kind of the concern, right? It's the Flames have this mix of a ton of really, really old players and then just super, super young guys, right? There's not a ton of balance on this team, and that worries me slightly, because when all these guys retire, like, you're just going to have these gaping holes in your top six, right? And it's top six guys, right? It's Blake Coleman, it's Mikael Backlund, it's, Nazem Kadri, it's Jonathan Huberdeau to a lesser extent. And that's like 4 guys that, were playing top 6 minutes for you last year that could all just leave, like, the snap of a finger. So it really kind of worries me that, the Flames could end up right back at the bottom of the NHL really quickly. And for as good as Backlund is, like, again, 1 year left on his deal, is this somebody that you potentially, go to and say, hey, like, we have the opportunity to move you to a cup contender so you can go try to win and, and end your career with a Stanley Cup? Maybe that's something that he's enticed by. And if he can still be, really, really good rock, defensive first, 5-on-5 low event center, who can bring, a bit of offensive play driving, against pretty good competition, then, there might be some value there. I don't think that he fetches a ton, but especially with, the lack of finishing that he has. But I do think that there's value in getting, a guy like Mikael Backlund to be your third-line center for a cup run. Joel Farabee, as I quickly touched on there, his offense, I don't know why he had to be, I must have typed it in the wrong spot. I don't know. Fight me. Anyway, his offense is not a B. He's, not great offensively. His defense is fine for a third liner. Like, I'm not really worried about it. He's only 26, so there is some chance that he could take a bit of a step forward there too. And I think he kind of has to, right? Like, if the Flames are going to be, a serious playoff team, like, guys like Joel Farabee need to be able to improve, especially with how old, some of the guys in the top 6 are, as we've talked about. A player like Joel Farabee becomes increasingly more important because of that ability to be a potential upgrade and somebody who can kind of, maybe push for one of those second line spots, because there's some pretty open spots on the wings on the second line. And even, the first line potentially. Now, I don't think Joel Farabee gets to that point. But, again, a bounce-back season for him offensively would do a lot for that. Now, he looked not good in his time in Calgary. He had 6 points in, I believe it was 31 games with the Flames. Not what you wanted from him. But, they got a ton of value in terms of defensive impact from Morgan Frost. So maybe that balanced it out. But, yeah, Joel Farabee, not great in his time so far in Calgary, but it was a small sample size, and obviously they're hoping to get a bit more out of him in a full season. Looking at this blue line, I still love Mackenzie Weegar. He's one of my favorite players. He's one of my favorite two-way defensemen in the NHL. I'm going to gush about him in a second because he rocks. Aside from that, I mean, you have Miramanov, who is, solid enough in terms, for what he is, but I don't think he's this, super high-end, first pair defenseman type player. He's a good second pair guy, and that's probably what he'll develop into over, the course of his career. Kevin Ball is a really good shutdown defender who I think was just paid too much money this summer. Then you have, Joel Hanley, who's extremely underrated defensively. He rocks defensively. But again, another Kevin Ball type player where he's just like a super low event, doesn't bring a ton of offense or any offense in terms of Hanley's case. And just, low event, nothing's going to happen when he's on the ice, which, again, based on how Calgary won games last year, might not be a bad thing. Jake Bean is just kind of a guy. Rasmus Anderson's the interesting one because as of now, he's on the roster. I don't expect him to be, maybe by the start of the season, but I don't know. But we'll talk about Rasmus Anderson a bit because, again, he's on the team as of now, and that's kind of all I care about. So there you go. Mackenzie Weegar just kind of rocks at everything, man. He's so good. He's such a great play driver. He can score. He can generate offense. He's a good passer. He's a good, power play quarterback. Defensively, he does not allow people to enter his zone consistently. He's able to clog up passing lanes super effectively. He doesn't allow a lot of shooting lanes. He's, physical enough for what he is. He's really kind of just the whole package in terms of a elite two-way defenseman. He's one of the best two-way defensemen in the league, period. Now he's going to his age 32 season, which again, like, shout out to the Flames for just having all these guys who are, starting to to decline in their careers right as soon as they get a potential franchise-changing goaltender and some solid young pieces. But hey, I mean, what can you do? So that's a concern. But overall, I mean, you're talking about a player who's just been so consistent. I mean, he has been, even his time in Florida, like the Mackenzie Weegar hate that was going on, even in his time in Florida. Now, obviously, like, Panthers fans aren't going to miss Mackenzie Weegar because they just won back-to-back cups as soon as he was traded, so I don't think they really care about the narrative around Mackenzie Weegar because, like, fair enough, like, you shouldn't. But, like, he's been underrated forever, and I just... He deserves the opportunity to kind of be in the spotlight for being as good as he is. Now, I get it. He turns the puck over quite a bit, and like, you kind of have to deal with that. But when you have a defenseman who's going to be, playing a possession game and trying to, move the puck up the ice a lot, you're going to turn the puck over quite a bit. That's just kind of par for the course with that kind of style of play. So it doesn't really worry me that much, especially because of how good he is defensively. Like, he's able to make up for a lot of those mistakes. Obviously, people remember the bad ones, and then the ones that lead to 3-on-1s the other way, and a goal. Like, those are the ones people are going to remember. But he turns the puck over a lot, and it doesn't lead to anything most of the time in terms of goals against. So it doesn't really bother me that much. Obviously, there's going to be a couple that he loses, but like, it over the course of a season, it's fun. Like, everybody's going to have bad turnovers basically, and yeah, he turns the puck over quite a bit. I don't really care. He's good enough defensively to make up for it, and I like Mackenzie Weegar. I'll defend Mackenzie Weegar until he like absolutely sucks. Like, that's just kind of how it is, and even then, I'll still defend Mackenzie Weegar for what he was at this point in his career, because he's awesome. Rasmus Andersson, as I talked about, is a trade candidate. Now, he's been declining for the last couple of years. He's going to his age 29 season. He's only making $4.6 million. And he, at a point, was extremely underrated and was a fantastic second defenseman, which means he's going to get paid a lot this summer. That's kind of how that works. Wherever that is, it's going to be a lot of money, especially based on what the Ivan Provorov contract looks like. I think that's a pretty reasonable number for Rasmus Andersson to begin his negotiations at. Offensively, he's still super, super effective, but as his offense has kind of hit a bit of a wall the last couple of years in terms of, progression, his defensive ability has just cratered. And it really creates this interesting situation because, like, offensively, he's still, pretty effective as an OFD, but he's not good enough to be like an Erik Karlsson level offensive defenseman, and be, super, super valuable. Now, do I think a change of scenery can help that? Yeah, absolutely, right? I think, if he does end up on a team like Vegas where they can shelter him like crazy, and play him with way more high-level players, I think Rasmus Andersson starts to look really, really good again. But, on Calgary, I think the longer they hold on to him, like, the more egregious those defensive errors are going to begin to show, especially with how good, like, the rest of this blue line is defensively. His defensive lapses are going to show up more. They did last year. And that's kind of why I'd be, like, clearly a deal is not going to happen here. And, like, I don't really want to pay Rasmus Andersson a ton of money in Calgary because I just, like, these are the results that we've seen. So, like, I'd be just kind of taking what you can get at this point. And not letting that asset potentially diminish even more if his offense, starts to peter out a little bit. The defense likely isn't going to suddenly become this great, unstoppable force. So it seems like a situation that Craig Conroy kind of mishandled in terms of when he should have pulled the trigger on an Andersson trade. And now he's going to have to kind of pay the consequences for that. Again, that's not saying that I think Rasmus Andersson's a bad defenseman. Obviously, I have him rated pretty highly, but it's something that I think it's time to move on, and we'll see if the Flames actually do that. Kevin Ball, like I said, really, really solid defensively. His ability to deny rushes is incredible. His defensive retrievals aren't fantastic, but you can kind of cover that up, especially playing with some of the other guys that he's been around here that can make him look better than that. Offensively, he isn't like a black hole. He's just not great. I just don't love the contract. I think paying, defensive first, low event guys don't bring a ton of value in terms of. I want to say this in a way that makes sense. Guys like Kevin Baller are useful, but I don't think they should be paid like top 4 defensemen. I don't think that there's enough. I think there's more value in having an offensive first defenseman because it's easier to win a game 6-5 than it is to win a game 1-0 all the time consistently. Maybe the Flames can prove me wrong on that. I mean, like, certainly the New York Islanders made that work. Well, they made losing games 2-1 all the time work as a way to get into the playoffs. So, it is possible, but it's hard for me to justify paying somebody who doesn't generate a ton of offense, who really doesn't like generate anything when they're on the ice, a ton of money, because like you're basically just limiting the amount of time that you have to counterattack. And that's certainly a philosophy thing with me, and like I understand that. But the Flames as a team isn't how I would build a roster, because I feel like the low event hockey limits what you can do in terms of a creative strategy to generate offense. So the Kevin Ball contract is kind of the epitome of that. It just kind of sums up the identity of this team, and like he's good. Like I don't. This isn't me trying to rip on Kevin Ball. I think he's useful for what he is as a defenseman, but it's like locking him up to a long-term deal with significant cap. Probably could replace somewhere else with a defenseman that's going to add a bit more value overall. So, but I like Kevin Ball. He's good for what he is. I just think he was overpaid, but he's solid as even as the 4th defenseman on this team based on what they needed from him and what he can do. Him being like the 4th defenseman on this team is fine. Finally, Joel Hanley, who again like is pretty similar to Kevin Ball. Like he has similar results, different style of play, but the results are similar. So I think you could have just let Kevin go, moved off of him in some capacity, and just threw Joel Hanley into that role, and it would have been a pretty similar outcome. Now, obviously, the offense is worse, but like I say that in quotations because like Kevin Ball wasn't this crazy offensive wizard either, so like it's kind of marginal at that point. But defensively, you're getting a really really solid defensive defenseman in Joel Hanley. So I think you could have again, like I said. I think it was in the Columbus video. It's been a couple times that I've said it, but I'm not going to rip a team apart for an offseason move if there was a better move to be made, or if there wasn't a better move to be made in that slot. And I think, like in this case, moving off of Kevin Ball would have made more sense than re-signing him. I get he fit well, in the top 4, but I think in terms of results, Joel Hanley could have got you something similar for significantly less money, and that acquisition cost, like the difference in that in the cap hit, would make up for the maybe the drop down in terms of overall impact on the ice. Finally, I want to talk about Miramanov a little bit. Again, like similar kind of story, right? Like a defensive first, second, third pair guy. He's going to his age 28 season. There is a ton of development that can happen there. He's a good finisher. I'll give him that, but like the competition hasn't been great. His assists aren't great. He doesn't generate a ton of offense, right? He's good at shutting down, opportunities and rushes, not allowing a ton of high danger chances against. He's a bit more physical than some guys that play his role, but in terms of this team, like he fits again like the mold of the team. And it's another, at $1.3 million for another year. I don't think his contract's going to be much more than that. I certainly don't think he's going to get the Kevin Ball contract. It's just another reason why like Kevin Ball could have been moved, and you could have brought in, a more dynamic defenseman, especially if Rasmus Anderson is on his way out and isn't going to re-sign. It felt like a missed opportunity to kind of, you have Miramanov, you have Joel Hanley, they can kind of make up the defensive defenseman, guys. But I think having 3 guys that fit that mold is a little excessive, and who knows how they replace Rasmus Anderson, right? Like it could be another one. I don't know if they're going to get a significant player back, especially from a team like Vegas or a contender, right? Who's trying to win a Stanley Cup, right? Like they're not going to give you a significant defenseman back in a trade like that. So I feel like the Flames had too many guys like Kevin Ball. I get it. He worked really well in the top 4. He had great chemistry. I get it. you miss the playoffs. Like, I think that you need to be a bit more aggressive than that. Obviously, one of the reasons why they were even close to the playoffs was Dustin Wolf. They also bring in, Prosvetov from the Colorado Avalanche, who is, just a fine goalie as a backup. He's okay. I'm not going to talk about him a lot. Dustin Wolf is the guy I want to talk about because, man, his numbers were fantastic last season. As a rookie, I was very adamant that, he would have been probably my second on my Calder ballot last year. I think he was fantastic. I think he had a case for the Hart Trophy, honestly. Not as a winner, but as somebody who deserved more recognition than he got, because a team that was 29th in goals for was also extremely low in generation of opportunities, and you had a goalie who really put the team on his back and was able to get them into a position where they could fight for a playoff spot. And obviously they came up short, but they were right kind of in the hunt, and this was a team that outperformed way higher than I thought they were going to. And for that, I think Dustin Wolf should have got a lot more credit in terms of award voting than he did. Obviously, I can make an argument that he could have won the Calder. I can't argue against Lane Hudson winning the Calder. I think they were both really good. But I think in terms of overall value, I don't think he got talked about a lot because of the fact this team missed the playoffs. So, which I think is unfortunate for players on bad teams, because it's a requirement that your team has to be competent enough to make the playoffs in order for you to be looked at as a serious contender for anything, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But that's a whole nother argument. I love Dustin Wolf. I think he's awesome. Goalies are weird. He could suck next year. I don't think that's very likely. Yeah. Special teams, as I talked about, it's just kind of okay. This isn't a group that I look at and it strikes fear into me. Now, they do have some opportunities for development. I think Coronado and Connor Zary will be better. Obviously, we don't know what the situation is with Rasmus Anderson. That's kind of, a question mark there. Mackenzie Weegar's weakest point is his, special teams ability. In terms of, the power play, at least, his penalty kill numbers are really, really strong. So there's that. So I don't know. It's a weird unit. I think that their penalty kill unit is better than the power play in terms of what they can bring, which fits the theme of this team, right? They're a defensive first team that's going to win games like that. I don't know how far that'll get you. It got the New York Islanders pretty far, so who knows? But I think it's a weird team building strategy if that's kind of what they've actually been going for, and it seems like based on the contracts they've handed out, that is kind of the idea. So there you go. That is the offseason outlook for the Calgary Flames. We're at team number 21. We've done 12 of these now, I guess. So we're a third-ish of the way there. So thank you for sticking around as long as you have. Please go watch the other videos that are up. We've had some great ones. We've had some great guests on too. I have some other crazy guests coming on as well. We have at least one really big one that I'm super excited about, but a couple other people that I'm really excited to have. So it's going to be good. So keep an eye on that. But thank you again for all the support on this series. It's a ton of work to put this together, and it really does mean a lot to see the comments, see the views, see the interactions on this, whether you agree or disagree with me. Any kind of feedback is great, because this takes a long time to put together. So thank you so much for that. I'm happy to continue to spend my summers doing this if you all like it. So show me that you do, and we'll see you for team number 20, which will be out in a couple days.